On a Wednesday morning in October of 1991, Doris Beauchamp stood inside a repair shed that smelled like hydraulic fluid and cold steel and listened to a man from Massey Ferguson's regional office explain, with the kind of practiced patience that comes from delivering the same news in too many towns, why the hydraulic pump rebuilding business was finished for independent operators like her. The man's name was Robert Beauchamp. He wore a company fleece and carried a folder, and he had driven 2.5 hours from the regional distribution center in Brantford, Ontario, to say what he had to say in person, which Doris thought was a peculiar thing to do for a company that was, as Robert Beauchamp described it, simply adapting to modern realities. The modern realities, as Robert saw them, meant factory exchange programs, centralized remanufacturing, and a parts strategy that didn't require women like Doris Beauchamp crouched over a bench in Hastings County, Ontario, measuring pump clearances with a micrometer by lamplight. Doris listened to all of it. She didn't argue, she didn't raise her voice. She thanked Robert Beauchamp for the drive, walked him back to his company truck, and watched him turn out of the lane and disappear behind the tree line. Then she went back inside the shed and picked up the pump she had been working on before he arrived, and she kept working. Let me tell you about Doris Beauchamp, because you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she built, and you need to understand what she built before you can understand why, 30 years later, it still matters. Doris was 43 years old in 1991. She had grown up outside Madoc, Ontario, the eldest of 3 children on a mixed grain and beef farm that her family had worked since her grandfather's time. She had learned early that equipment either ran or didn't, and that the difference between those two states was usually something small and knowable if you were willing to look carefully enough and long enough. She had taken a 2-year diploma in agricultural mechanics at Loyalist College in Belleville, graduated in 1970, and spent the following 8 years doing field service for an implement dealer in Tweed. In 1979, she had used $12,000 in savings to buy a hydraulic press, a precision bore gauge set, a test stand, and a set of pump rebuilding fixtures, and she had converted the old equipment shed behind her house into what she called, with no drama whatsoever, the shop. She rebuilt hydraulic pumps and motors and cylinders, gear pumps, piston pumps, vane units. She did it for farmers, drainage contractors, municipal road crews, and small equipment rental operations across a wide radius of Hastings and Lennox counties. She charged fair prices. She stood behind her work. She had rebuilt, by her own rough estimate, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 units in 12 years, by the time Robert Beauchamp showed up to tell her the industry was moving on. The industry was moving on. That part was true. Let me tell you what moving on looked like in 1991 in Eastern Ontario, because it is important to understand what Doris was facing in practical terms rather than vague ones. The manufacturer exchange programs that Massey and Deere and Case were rolling out offered dealers a clean swap arrangement: bring in the failed unit, send it to a central remanufacturing facility in the States or in Quebec, get a rebuilt exchange unit back within a week. For the dealer, it was simple. For the farmer, with a newer machine still under some form of warranty relationship, it was acceptable. The problem was price. A factory exchange pump for a mid-range tractor ran between $160 and $240 depending on the application. A rebuild from Doris cost between $70 and $110. The math pointed one direction. The math was why Robert Beauchamp had made the drive. Doris understood the math. She had been watching the exchange programs expand for 3 years before Robert arrived. What she did not believe, and had never believed, was that the math told the whole story. Let me tell you about what Doris knew that Robert Beauchamp did not, because this is where the story actually starts. Doris had been rebuilding hydraulic components long enough to understand that not all failures were the same, and she had been in Hastings County long enough to know that not all equipment was the same either. The farmers she served were not replacing pumps the way a person replaces a light bulb. They were dealing with machines they intended to run for another decade or two, often machines that were already 20 or 30 years old, machines for which the factory exchange program had no core on the shelf and no interest in finding one. A farmer running a 1967 International 504 with a Charlin orbital motor, or a 1972 Ford 5000 with an original Dowdy gear pump, could not walk into the dealership and hand over a core and wait for an exchange. The exchange program didn't service those applications. The distribution center in Brantford didn't stock those specifications. The centralized remanufacturing facility had optimized for volume, and the volume was in current production, not in machines that had been off the line for 2 decades. Doris had those cores. She had the specs. She had a parts shelf with new seals and bearing kits, sourced through 3 different hydraulic supply houses she'd been dealing with since 1980. And she had a filing system, not a computer, not a database. A steel cabinet with hanging folders organized by manufacturer and then by model, and then by year, that held her own documentation on more than 400 pump and motor variants. On each sheet, she had written the clearance tolerances, the relief valve settings, the torque specs, the seal dimensions, and her own notes on what had failed and what the fix was and whether the failure was in the pump itself or somewhere else in the system. The last part mattered more than people understood. A failed pump was sometimes a failed pump. Quite often it was a symptom of something upstream, a blocked suction line, a contaminated reservoir, a worn relief valve that had been passing metal particles into the circuit for months. If you rebuilt the pump and sent it back without identifying the root cause, you'd be seeing that customer again in 8 months with another destroyed unit. The exchange program couldn't do a system diagnosis from a remanufacturing facility in Quebec. Doris could because she was there in the yard with the machine running. That filing cabinet was what Robert Villieu had driven 2.5 hours to make irrelevant. Doris kept working. Let me tell you about the 3 years that followed because they shaped everything that came after. Between 1991 and 1994, several of the independent hydraulic shops in the region closed or scaled back to simple seal replacement only, abandoning the precision rebuild work that required proper tooling and genuine knowledge. Doris watched it happen from her bench. She didn't say much about it publicly. Her husband, Rene, who had kept the shop's accounts since 1980 and who was rather better at seeing financial reality clearly than Doris sometimes permitted herself to be, sat her down in the winter of 1992 and went through the numbers in specific terms. He told her they had billed $68,000 in 1990 and $51,000 in 1991, and were tracking toward $44,000 for 1992. Doris said she knew the revenue had dropped. Rene said he wanted her to know the actual numbers, not the approximate shape of the numbers. Doris looked at the ledger for a while, then she said she thought they needed to find the customers the exchange programs couldn't reach, and she thought there were more of them than the manufacturers believed. She was right, but proving it took time, and the time was uncomfortable. Let me tell you what Doris did in 1992 and 1993. Because it was not what most people in her position did, and it explains everything that came afterward. While other independent shops were retreating or closing, Doris was driving. She put roughly 18,000 kilometers on her truck in 1992, driving to farms, drainage operations, municipal equipment yards, and woodlot contractors across the county and beyond. She wasn't selling. She was asking questions. She wanted to know what equipment people were running, how old it was, what hydraulic problems they'd been having, and whether the dealership or the parts store had been able to sort them out. What she found, property by property, was a customer base the centralized programs had not accounted for and could not serve. These were the operators of older equipment, machines that were 15, 25, 30 years old, equipment for which nobody was stocking cores because the volume didn't justify it. Equipment that the exchange program had quietly categorized as out of scope. A municipal road crew running a 1969 Galeon grader with a Vickers vane pump couldn't use the exchange program. A drainage contractor still running a 1974 Case backhoe with an original Cesta hydraulic motor couldn't use it either. Nobody was serving those customers with precision rebuild work anymore. Doris was. She also found something she hadn't entirely anticipated. She found that the farmers and contractors who had tried the factory exchange units were, in a meaningful number of cases, not satisfied. Not because the exchange units were badly made. Most of them performed acceptably at first. They didn't last. A contractor named Émile Deschamps outside of Sterling told Doris in the spring of 1993 that he had installed 2 exchange pumps on the same machine in 14 months. And the second failure had happened in the middle of a tile drainage job in September, when the field conditions were exactly wrong for sitting idle. He had lost a full day and a half of billing, which was not a small number for a one-man operation. Doris rebuilt him an original Bosch piston pump to the factory tolerance specifications, tested it at full pressure on her stand for 40 minutes, and handed it back with a note explaining what she had found and why the previous units had failed. Émile Deschamps called his neighbor that evening. The neighbor called someone else. Word moves the way it moves in rural Ontario, slowly and then all at once. Let me tell you about 1995, because 1995 was the year the shop's direction changed in a way Doris had not planned for, specifically but had in some sense prepared for simply by being who she was. By that spring, Doris had rebuilt her billing back close to its 1990 level, but the composition of the work had changed completely. The dealership warranty trade was gone, and she didn't miss it. What she had instead was a steady core of farmers, contractors, and municipal operators who ran older equipment and who had come to understand through direct experience that her work outlasted the alternative. She had also, during the years of driving and asking, stumbled into something she had not expected: a small but real market among collectors and restorers of vintage farm equipment who needed hydraulic components rebuilt to original specification for machines the parts industry had entirely abandoned. She placed small notices in 2 agricultural heritage publications, one out of St. Jacobs and one out of Carleton Place, describing what she could do and for which applications. Within 5 months, she was shipping rebuilt pumps and motors to customers in 7 provinces and 4 American states. Renee updated the books. The 1995 billing came to $76,000. It was the best year the shop had ever had. Robert Vila did not make a return visit. Now let me ask you something directly. Have you ever watched a system tell a skilled person that what they know no longer has value, and then watch that person, without any announcement or argument, simply continue doing the work, and let the quality speak for what arguments never could? Because that is what Doris Beauchamp did between 1991 and 1995, and it is worth staying with that for a moment before the story moves forward, because the story is about to become more complicated. Let me tell you about the shop itself. Because the shop matters, and because most people who turned off the county road onto her lane saw a weathered equipment shed and thought nothing particular of it. From the road, it looked like half the property outbuildings in Hastings County: timber frame, board and batten siding, gone gray, a gravel apron in front, and a pair of sodium lights on a crossbar that came on at dusk. A painted sign by the lane read "Beauchamp Hydraulic Service" in black on white, the letters faded enough that you had to slow down to read them. Inside was something different. The press was a 1963 Walker Near hydraulic bench unit that Doris had bought at a farm auction in Prince Edward County for $320 and rebuilt over one winter. The bore gauge set had come from a tool and die shop in Belleville that had closed in 1976. Precision Mitutoyo instruments that were better than anything the local tool suppliers currently stocked. The test stand Doris had built herself over the course of 2 winters from a 1952 Massey Harris engine block bolted to a welded steel frame, plumbed to a variable displacement hydraulic circuit that could load test a pump at any pressure from 500 to 3,000 psi and any flow rate her customers were likely to encounter. It had cost her more time than money, and it was, by any reasonable standard, more capable than the benches at most dealerships. The seal supply wall, a pegboard system covering one full side of the shop, held organized bins of O-rings, lip seals, backup rings, and shaft seals in every dimension she had ever needed, cross-referenced by her own catalog system to the pump models in her filing cabinet. She had learned early that seal availability was the single most common reason independent shops turned away old equipment, and she had decided in 1983 that she would not turn work away for that reason. The filing cabinet was a 4-drawer unit, olive green, positioned beside the door. By 1995, the folders numbered more than 500. By 1999, they were past 800. Doris added a folder every time she encountered a unit she hadn't worked on before and updated existing folders when she found something new. If you asked her where the information came from, she would pull the folder, spread it on the bench, and point to the handwriting. She would say she had pulled the unit apart and measured everything that could be measured. That was the whole approach. Pull it apart and measure. Let me tell you about the summer of 1997, because that was when the drop-offs began. And the drop-offs are the reason this story has the shape it does. A farmer named Conrad Villeneuve from outside of Tweed arrived one morning with a failed hydraulic motor wrapped in a grain sack in the back of his pickup. Conrad explained that it had come off a 1961 Coxsut 540 that his father had bought new, and that he and his son were trying to restore together. He had called 2 dealers and a parts supplier in Peterborough, and none of them would touch it. Doris unwrapped it. It was a Charlin unit, shaft seal blown, end plate scored, with wear on the gear set that suggested it had been run with contaminated fluid for some time before it finally gave out. She told Conrad it would take 10 days and cost $90. Conrad said that was fine. Doris rebuilt it, sourced the replacement end plate from her parts inventory, lapped the mating surfaces on her surface plate, installed new seals throughout, and had it running on the test stand. Smooth, no leak down, full torque at rated pressure before she called him. Conrad Villeneuve mentioned her name to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and within a year, Doris was receiving drop-offs from across Ontario and then from Quebec and Manitoba, and eventually from as far as Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. People drove out to her lane with units in cardboard boxes and feed buckets and wooden crates packed in sawdust. One man from New Brunswick put a pair of Sunstrand piston motors in a Rubbermaid cooler and drove 11 hours because he said he'd made 17 phone calls, and she was the only person who'd said yes. Doris rebuilt all of them. Renee started a formal waiting list in 1998. At various points through the late 1990s, it ran between 8 and 13 weeks. Let me tell you about what was happening in the hydraulic repair industry during those same years, because the contrast is important, and because it tells you something about what happens when an entire sector decides that older knowledge is a cost rather than an asset. The remanufacturing programs continued to expand and consolidate through the late 1990s. Quality varied enormously. The units rebuilt at volume facilities were adequate for current production machines running clean fluid in normal conditions. They were less adequate for older machines, machines with worn circuits, machines operating in dusty or cold or high cycle environments. The failure data was there for anyone willing to look at it, but the volume facilities weren't structured to look at individual failure patterns. They were structured to process cores and ship exchange units and manage warranty claims at scale. The knowledge that came from opening a specific unit from a specific machine and asking why it failed. Specifically, not generally, that knowledge was not part of the model. Doris was accumulating exactly that knowledge, one folder at a time, in a green filing cabinet in a shed on a county road in Hastings County. She was building a case record without intending to build one. She was just paying attention. Let me tell you about 2001, because 2001 was the year Doris did something that surprised even Renee. She was 53 years old. The shop was as busy as it had ever been. The waiting list was at 10 weeks. Renee had suggested more than once that she consider taking on help, someone younger who could handle volume and learn the trade and eventually carry the work forward. Doris had been thinking about that. She had also been thinking about the filing cabinet. She had 800 folders representing more than 20 years of pulling apart hydraulic components and writing down what she found, and there was no copy of any of it. The shed could burn. She could be gone, and with her the folders, and with the folders the knowledge, and the knowledge was, she had come to understand clearly, the actual thing she was selling. The rebuilt pumps were the proof of it. The knowledge was the thing itself. So in the spring of 2001, Doris Beauchamp, who had never owned a computer and who read her technical manuals in paper form, sat down with a woman from the Maddock Public Library named Joan Everett, who offered a basic word processing class on Thursday evenings, and she learned. It took her 3 months to become functional and another month before she was fast enough to make the effort worthwhile. She began transcribing the folders in the evenings after the shop closed, 2 or 3 entries a night. It took her until the spring of 2004 to finish. The resulting document ran to 191 pages. Doris printed 4 copies. She gave one to Renee. She put one in a fireproof cabinet in the house. She kept one in the shop. She gave the 4th to her daughter, who lived in Kingston and who was instructed to keep it somewhere dry. She did not publish it. She did not put it online. She simply made sure it would survive her. Let me tell you about the morning in May of 2005 when a man named Francois Ouellet drove up her lane in a pickup with Quebec plates and changed the scope of what the shop did in a way that was not entirely planned but was, in retrospect, inevitable. Francois Ouellet was 44 years old and ran a small parts distribution operation out of Drummondville that supplied independent repair shops and vintage equipment restorers across Quebec and eastern Ontario. He had heard about Doris through a restorer in Carleton Place who had shipped a cockshot motor out to her 2 years before. He had driven to Hastings County not to drop off a core, but to have a conversation. He wanted to know whether Doris would consider a wholesale arrangement in which she would rebuild units for his operation to sell through its catalog at a modest private label, covering heritage farm hydraulic applications that no current supplier was servicing. The volume would be meaningful. Francois thought he could move 150 to 200 units annually to start, possibly more as the heritage equipment market grew. Doris listened to all of it. Then she said her waiting list was at 10 weeks and she wasn't sure she could absorb volume without losing what made the work reliable. Francois said he understood. He said he wasn't looking for speed. He said he had looked at 3 other operations before finding his way to her lane, and none of them had what she had. He said he needed quality that he could stand behind personally, and he had heard her name often enough that he wanted to see the shop before he kept looking elsewhere. Doris said she would think about it. She talked to Renee that evening. Renee said he thought they should do it, but only on the condition that they brought on help first, and only if Doris was willing to train that person herself so the standard stayed consistent. Doris said she thought that was right. She hired a young man named Aaron Leclerc from Bancroft in the fall of 2005. Aaron was 26 years old, had grown up on a farm, had been doing basic equipment maintenance since he was a teenager, and had a mechanical intuition that Doris recognized within the first week as genuine. She spent 6 months teaching him the trade the way she had learned it, which was by taking things apart and measuring everything. Aaron learned to read the folders. He learned the test stand protocol, which involved running every rebuilt unit at full rated pressure for a minimum of 30 minutes before it left the shop. A standard no-volume remanufacturer Doris knew of was still applying. He learned to think about the circuit, not just the component. By the spring of 2006, Aaron could handle most common applications without supervision. Doris began taking Francois Ouellet's wholesale work. The waiting list dropped to 5 weeks. Renee updated the books. The 2006 billing came to $104,000. Let me tell you about what was happening in the broader market in 2006 and 2007, because the broader market was about to make a series of discoveries that would cause certain people to look back at a green filing cabinet in Hastings County with some regret. The import hydraulic components that had been moving into the Canadian agricultural market since the mid-1990s had, by 2006, established a failure profile that was becoming difficult for the industry to ignore. The castings were lighter, the clearances were looser, the seal compounds were inconsistent in ways that showed up particularly in cold starts, which in Ontario meant roughly 5 months of the year. Fleet operators were tracking warranty returns they could not explain by operator error alone. The volume remanufacturers were processing returned exchange units at rates that were cutting into margins and generating complaints from dealers who had sold the program on quality grounds, and the import units were making their way into older machines in ways that created particular problems, because the older circuits were less tolerant of the pressure spikes and flow irregularities that loose manufacturing tolerances produced. Doris was not immune to any of this. She was, however, positioned differently from everyone else in the market. She had spent 15 years refusing to optimize for price and refusing to cut her test protocol, and she had a filing cabinet full of specific failure documentation on applications that nobody else in the country was servicing with wheel precision. And she had a young man named Aaron who had spent a year learning to do the work the way it needed to be done. The phone started ringing differently. Let me tell you about the call that came in March of 2007, because it was the call Doris had not expected, and that Renee said afterward he probably should have seen coming, because he had been watching the billing numbers long enough to understand that what Doris had built was not a small thing, even if Doris herself treated it like ordinary work. The call came from a municipal equipment manager named Gary Pelletier, who oversaw the maintenance of a mixed fleet of road graders, loaders, and plow trucks for a township west of Peterborough. Gary had been using exchange program units for 7 years. In 2006, he had processed 11 hydraulic pump failures across a fleet that, at proper service intervals, should have produced 2 or 3 in a year. The repair cost was one thing. The downtime during winter road maintenance was another. A grader out of service during a February storm was not an accounting problem. It was a public safety problem, and Gary's counsel had been making that point clearly. He had heard about Doris through Francois Ole. Gary asked whether Doris could rebuild his fleet's pump cores to a standard that would hold through a full season of winter operations. Doris said she could. Gary asked about warranty. Doris said 1 year. Unconditional, return the core, and she'd rebuild it at no charge. Gary asked about price. She quoted him $68 per unit for his most common application, more than the exchange program, considerably less than 11 failures a year. Gary Pelletier sent 14 cores in April of 2007. Doris and Aaron rebuilt all of them, ran each one on the test stand for 30 minutes minimum, and shipped them back by mid-May. Gary installed them across the fleet through the summer. That winter, 1 unit was returned under warranty, 1 out of 14. The exchange program had been running at roughly 4 to 5 failures per comparable group per season. Gary Pelletier called Doris in October of 2008 and told her he wanted to send the rest of the fleet. He also said, and Doris wrote it down because she thought Renee would want to read it, that in 21 years of municipal fleet management, no parts supplier had ever called him in the middle of the season simply to ask how things were running. Doris had called him the previous January to do exactly that. Gary said it was the first time. Doris said she just wanted to know if the units were holding up. Gary said most suppliers, he had noticed, didn't particularly want to know. Let me tell you about 2008, because 2008 tested a great many things in a great many industries, and Eastern Ontario was not spared. Equipment purchases stalled, capital dried up, farms and contractors and municipalities all tightened spending in ways that were felt immediately and in specific dollar amounts. What it meant for the shop, paradoxically, was more work of a particular kind. When new equipment is not being bought, old equipment must be kept running, and old equipment that must be kept running needs someone who can fix the parts that no supplier is stocking anymore. Doris's waiting list climbed back to 9 weeks in the spring of 2009. Aaron's younger sister Chantal, who had been doing accounts work for a dental office in Bancroft, came on part-time to help Renee with invoicing and correspondence, which had grown past what Renee could manage alone. Doris spent 2 months training Aaron on a new set of applications they hadn't encountered before, mostly older Sunstrand and Sauer, closed-loop hydrostatic units from combines and self-propelled harvesters. She added 30 new folders to the cabinet. Renee updated the books. The 2009 billing came to $142,000. Let me tell you about the conversation at the Hastings County Agricultural Society Fall Supper in November of 2010, because it is the conversation that addresses most directly what this story is actually about, and because it involves a man named Douglas Fairweather, who had been the parts and service manager at the largest implement dealership in the county for 17 years, and who had, in those 17 years, sent exactly nothing to Doris Beauchamp. Douglas Fairweather was a man who believed in the supply chain as a matter of principle. The supply chain had programs and pricing structures and corporate relationships, and independent operators who worked out of sheds on county roads were not part of the supply chain and therefore not part of his operational thinking. He was not unkind about this. He had said at a previous event 2 years earlier, when someone had mentioned Doris's name in connection with a difficult application, that he was sure she did fine work for the customers who required that sort of arrangement. He had moved a conversation along immediately afterward, which was its own kind of answer. Doris had heard about it. She hadn't commented. At the 2010 supper, Douglas found himself at the same table as Doris, and the conversation turned, as it does in November in agricultural communities, to equipment reliability and parts sourcing and the state of the supply chain going into winter. Douglas mentioned that his dealership had been managing a significant volume of hydraulic warranty returns on certain current model applications, units failing within the service period at rates that were creating friction with customers and with the manufacturer's warranty department. He said the parts quality had gotten inconsistent and the support from the program had gotten slower, and he wasn't sure the current arrangement was sustainable. He said this to the table generally, not to Doris specifically. Doris said quietly that she might be able to help with some of those applications. Douglas looked at her for a moment. He said he appreciated that, but his dealership operated through approved supplier channels, and he didn't think a single-person shop would meet the program requirements. Doris said she understood. She said if Douglas ever wanted to send a core over to see what the work looked like, the lane was easy to find. Douglas drove out to the county road 7 weeks later with a punk core in the back of his truck. He hadn't called ahead. He pulled onto the gravel apron, and Doris came out of the shed, and Douglas handed her the core and said he had 3 repeated failures on this specific model in one season, and he couldn't account for it through normal wear. Doris looked at the unit for a moment. She said she thought she had seen this before. She said, "Come back in 4 days." Douglas came back in 4 days. Doris handed him the rebuilt pump and the original folders she had made for that application, updated with her notes on what she had found in his failed unit. Douglas read through it at the bench. He asked whether she had documented this failure pattern previously. Doris said yes. She had seen the same issue on 3 units in the past 18 months, all appearing to be from the same production batch, and she had written down what she found each time because she found it every time. Douglas asked how she had known to look for it. Doris said she ran everything at full pressure for 30 minutes minimum, and she watched every number that could be watched, and if anything moved that shouldn't move, she opened the unit back up and looked until she found out why. She said that was the protocol. It had always been the protocol. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long is your waiting list?" Doris said 9 weeks, give or take. Douglas said he could manage that. Let me tell you about the years between 2011 and 2019, because those were the years in which what Doris had built stopped being a shed operation and started being something more difficult to put a simple name to. The dealership work from Douglas Fairweather's shop arrived steadily and grew without being pushed. Francois Owelet's catalog business continued. Gary Pelletier's township continued sending cores. The restoration and vintage equipment market, which had been finding its way down her lane for 15 years through word of mouth, kept arriving. Renee handled the accounts. Chantal moved from part-time to full-time. Aaron was working independently on everything except the most unusual applications. Doris was 63 in 2011 and 71 in 2019, and she was still in the shed every day, still pulling folders from the cabinet, still running the test stand herself on any unit she wasn't completely certain about. She had added perhaps 250 folders since completing the transcription. The document had been updated 3 times. It now ran to 238 pages and existed in 4 printed copies and on a USB drive that Renee kept in the fireproof cabinet. The shed had not changed. The Walker near press was still there, the Mitutoyo gauge set was still there, the test stand built from the Massey Harris engine was still there. Doris had replaced the pump on the test stand's hydraulic circuit twice. She had replaced the bench lighting once. She had not replaced anything that still worked, because things that still worked were not problems. Let me tell you about 2019. Because 2019 was the year the last major independent hydraulic remanufacturing operation in Ontario that Doris had known when she started announced it was consolidating operations and closing its Canadian facility. The press release used language like operational realignment and supply chain integration, which were different words for the same thing Philip Adler's words had meant in 1991, which was that the people making the decision had concluded that Canadian labor and Canadian knowledge were costs to be reduced rather than capabilities to be preserved. Doris read about it in a trade newsletter that Aaron had left on the bench. She read it through once. She set it down. She picked up the pump she had been working on and kept working. Aaron asked her what she thought. She said she thought it was hard for the people who worked there. She said she didn't think it changed much for the shop. Aaron asked why not. Doris said because the equipment was still out there and the cores were still coming in and the folders were still in the cabinet. She said the customers who needed the work done properly had not become fewer. If anything, they had become more concentrated because there were fewer places left to take certain problems. Aaron said that was probably true. Doris said it was definitely true, and she handed him the unit she had been working on and told him to put it on the test stand. Let me tell you about the afternoon in September of 2021 when Douglas Fairweather drove out to the lane for what turned out to be the last time before Doris stepped back from the bench, because it closes a loop that had been open for 11 years, and because it is the kind of conversation that doesn't happen often enough. Douglas had been sending work to the shop for a decade. He had not thought about approved supplier channels in years. He pulled onto the gravel apron and Doris came out of the shed and they stood in the September light, and Douglas said he had been meaning to ask her something for a while. He wanted to know how she had decided, back in 1991 when the whole industry was moving away from independent operators, that there would be enough work to keep going. Doris thought about it for a moment. She said she hadn't known for certain. She said she had believed that if the work was done properly, the people who needed it done properly would eventually find her. Douglas said that sounded more like faith than calculation. Doris said she thought it was probably both, and that the two were not as different as people sometimes assumed. Douglas asked what would happen to the shop when she retired. Doris said Aaron was going to take it over. She said Aaron had been ready for 4 years, and had simply been too considerate to raise it himself. Douglas smiled. He said he suspected that was accurate. Doris stepped back from the bench in the spring of 2022. She was 74 years old. The shop did not close. Aaron LeClaire took over the operation. Chantal stayed on. The waiting list at the time of the handover was at 8 weeks. The filing cabinet stayed in the corner. The document, now updated to 253 pages, stored in 4 printed copies and on 2 USB drives, stayed in the fireproof cabinet. The Walker Near press stayed. The Mitutoyo gauges stayed. The test stand built from the Massey Harris stayed. Doris gave Aaron one instruction at the handover. She said, "If you don't know what's wrong with it, pull it apart and measure everything you can measure." Aaron said he knew. Doris said she knew he knew. She just wanted to say it out loud once, so it had been said. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Doris stepping back, and it doesn't end with Aaron at the bench, and it doesn't end with the filing cabinet standing in the corner. Though all of those things are part of what it means, the story ends, if it ends anywhere, with a question that Robert Villiers' operation never had to answer, and that the press release about operational realignment and supply chain integration never had to answer, which is this: what happens to the knowledge? When a facility consolidates and moves, the equipment goes with it or gets auctioned, and the workers find other work and the supply chain shifts, and in a few years the gaps become visible only when someone needs something the new arrangement cannot provide. The market adjusts, slowly and at some cost. But the knowledge, the specific, accumulated, documented knowledge of how a particular component behaves and why it fails and what the fix requires, that knowledge does not move automatically. It lives in the people who did the work. It lives in the folders and the printed pages and the handwritten notes of the people who paid close enough attention to write down what they found. And when those people are gone, and the folders are gone, the knowledge is gone, and the market discovers over time and at some expense that it needed that knowledge more than it had realized while it was still available. Doris Beauchamp is 76 years old. She still comes into the shop on Tuesday and Friday mornings. She doesn't run the bench anymore. She reads the folders when Aaron has a question about something unusual. She watches the test stand numbers when something doesn't add up. And occasionally, when a unit comes in that she hasn't seen in years, she pulls the folder herself and checks her own handwriting against what Aaron has found. And sometimes she adds a line. The Walker Near press is still running. The Mitutoyo gauges are still in use. The test stand built from the Massey Harris engine is still running. And somewhere in a consolidated facility in a province where the labor costs are lower and the overhead is manageable, there is no green filing cabinet in the corner, and no folders with handwritten tolerances, and no person who has been pulling things apart and measuring them for 40 years and writing down what they found. That is a difference between a supply chain and a person who knows what they are doing. One of them can be moved anywhere. The other one is built in a place over time, and it stays where it was built, and it keeps working, and the people who need what it knows keep finding their way down the lane. I think about the moment Doris watched Robert Vialu's truck disappear behind the tree line and then turned around and walked back into the shed and picked up the pump she had been working on. That was the whole decision right there. No speech, no declaration, just a woman who understood what she knew and chose to keep trust in it. What strikes me is that Doris never tried to win an argument. She didn't write letters or show up at industry meetings or try to prove anything to anyone who hadn't asked. What she did instead was something quieter and, I think, harder. She held to a standard of honesty in her work that didn't shift depending on who was watching or what the market was rewarding that particular year. She charged what the work was worth. She tested every unit the same way, whether the customer was a township fleet manager or a farmer with a single old tractor. She called Gary Pelletier in January just to ask if the pumps were holding up, not because it benefited her to do it, but because she thought it was the right thing to know. That kind of integrity is easy to describe and genuinely difficult to maintain over 4 decades, especially when the easier path is sitting right there and nobody would blame you for taking it. But integrity alone doesn't explain what Doris built. The other part of it was the quality of her attention. 800 folders, 30 years of pulling components apart and writing down what she found, not because someone required it, not because there was a system in place telling her to do it, but because she had decided early that understanding something properly was worth more than processing it quickly. She understood that a failed pump was often a symptom, not a cause. She understood that the same component could fail differently depending on the machine it came from and the conditions it had been running in. That kind of understanding doesn't come from a catalog or a training program. It comes from paying close attention for a very long time and being honest enough with yourself to write down what you actually found, rather than what you actually found, rather than what you expected to find. That's a form of intellectual integrity that I find genuinely rare. And then there's the question of persistence. The years between 1991 and 1995 were not comfortable years. The billing was dropping, the regional shops were closing, the industry was moving in a direction that made no room for what Doris was doing. She kept going anyway, not because she was stubborn in a blind way, but because she had looked honestly at the situation and concluded that the customers who needed precision work still existed, and that she was capable of serving them better than the alternative. That belief was not certainty. It was a reasoned bet based on her own knowledge and her own record, and she made it without any guarantee that it would pay off. What I keep coming back to is the filing cabinet, not as a symbol, but as a literal object. Olive green, 4 drawers, sitting by the door of a shed on a county road. Everything Doris had learned, written down in her own hand, updated as she learned more, preserved because she understood that the knowledge was the actual thing of value. When she sat down with Joan Everett at the Maddock Library and learned to type with 2 fingers so she could transcribe those folders, she wasn't thinking about legacy. She was thinking practically about what would happen if the cabinet burned. That kind of thinking, careful, unglamorous, oriented entirely toward doing the thing right, is what the whole story is made of. Robert Villio drove away, certain he was delivering news. Doris went back inside and kept working. 30 years later, the shed is still running, and the knowledge is still there, and the people who need what it holds keep finding their way down the lane. That's not luck. That's what happens when someone decides, quietly and without announcement, to be genuinely good at something, and to keep being good at it for as long as the work is needed.